Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Okay, students, this is lecture number 11 on discourse analysis. The topic of today's discussion is socio-symbolic function of language. Students, in today's lecture, we may have an overview of the discussion, and then we discuss sign, symbol, symptom, language and the group, methodology of empiric social act research, and transitory social acts. Students, this semester starts from premise known since antiquity that speech indicates something of the speaker. Language as action is regarded not only as a medium to convey lexical or semantic information, but also of social meaning. This raises the question, how can we get access to the social meaning of linguistic structure? This is the main question dealt with throughout this discussion. It sets out with carefully defining the notion of symbolic meaning on the grounds of social semiotics. Students, it then develops the sociological concept of group as a cultural subsystem of society. In order to understand better the relationship between language variation as options of linguistic choice and social act as a group specific linguistic variety. Students, within this conceptual framework, contours of a social grammar are outlined, which describes the socio-symbolic functions of phonetic, prosodic, morphological, lexical, syntactical, textual, and pragmatic elements of linguistic structure. Students, the perspective then broadens to the level of discourse on which the relationship of language and prestige on language and power is dealt with. Students, the classic premise of the speaker's social exposure through language is derived from the assumption held since classical antiquity that language provides the hearer with information about the current speaker. Students, this notion was also emphasized by Ben Jonson going back to Erasmus of Rotterdam in maintaining that language must shall a man speak that I may see thee, because language is an activity performed by social subjects. Students, it has always been regarded not only as a medium for information but also as a social symbol. The expression symbol is a key concept of multiple disciplines. In the present context, it is semiotically specified in two respects. First, as a sign after the intrigue formula aliquid pro aliquo, and second, more specifically, as a conventional, arbitrary sign. However, how can we get access to the social meaning of linguistic structures? What exactly is the social meaning of certain expressions of different linguistic levels of description? Language, students, obtain social meaning through variability. The speaker has a choice. He makes a selection from a set of alternative ways of saying the same thing. Students, for this, it requires sociolinguistic knowledge to define precisely the nature of the linguistic features that are the basis of these judgments of social identity. Students, the speaker's knowledge about the word and about the signs that transmit this information allows him both to communicate to others and to understand what is conveyed to him through a set of familiar signs. Students, the expression of signs is simultaneously and very literally an expression of the self. The speaker conveys to others his identity in terms of a person or a social subject. He is not simply a sender of a message and not simply a performer of actions producing utterances. Students, though he can do this more or less consciously and willingly and more or less clearly in communication, it is not possible for him not to also convey information about himself. Even a catatonic person, with his unwillingness to communicate, signals the social meaning of a pathological unsociability. Students, the issue, however, is not only about what a speaker conveys or signals beyond language itself. It is not only about signaling his professional role by wearing a uniform, for example, nor is it about conveying the underlying message by emphasizing an ironic utterance with the appropriate mimic and prosodic feature, by confusing his conversational partner with a discrepancy between the words uttered and the accompanying mimic and prosodic features, or by underlying his status in front of others with certain symbols. Students, it is primarily about the dual characteristic of a sign acknowledged since classical antiquity, which is simultaneously a symbol for a signified third and a symptom for personal and social features of the producer. Students, the symptomatic function of a linguistic sign allows its receiver not only to interpret in a symbolic functional way what it signifies, objects and facts, but also to make inferences about what it expresses. Students, this connection has become commonplace since Cole, Fuller, and is a means of membership, categorization with a socially stabilizing and reassuring function, without which everyday communication would become awkward and problematic. Students, close examination of a social system from a purely structural or functional point of view suggests that the individual's position in society and his roles within are not at all rigid. Status, position, and role are all categories that are interfered through a process of orientation to cognition and interpretation of social features derived from a person's actions. Students, apart from all systems of status and roles, the individual is situated within social groups within which his identity is developed and formed. Traditional sociolinguistics was mainly concerned with the attempt to investigate the significance of social classes and roles within the structural and functional dimensions of social systems. For example, linguistic strata or linguistic codes according to social class in the sense of Basil Bernstein. Students, in this respect, the question of social significance of linguistic signs leads to a focus on the cultural dimension of the group as the normal case of socialization of the individual. The process of social structurization allows certain predictions of actions due to conventionalization of rules for social behavior, and thus also condition for cooperative social interaction. Students, the process of differentiation can be seen as diametrically opposed to this. Indeed, the instrumental and effective demarcation of groups based on individual features of their group members lead both to a homogenization and a relativization of expectations, needs, and interests. Students, the balance of tension between stability and creativity, and between innovation and functionality determines the potential of action and performance of a group. In terms of differentiation of internal group structures, similar observation can be made concerning larger entities and ultimately also society as a whole. Students, one can distinguish partial cultures within the overall culture of a society, which differ from each other in terms of a group, in terms of a corpus of features such as increased group internal solidarity and cohesion. Their relation to the overall culture does not necessarily have to be described in terms of their divergence from it, which in social sciences is associated with the term subculture. Students, rather than measuring the grade of divergence from the actual structure, one can define subcultures in terms of their respectively divided rules and maxims, their norms and values, their social features of their members, and the objectives of these group members. Friends, no one speaks the same way all the time, and people constantly exploit the nuances of languages they speak for a wide variety of purposes. Language will be seen to exhibit considerable internal variation, and single-style speakers will not be found. The variation you are permitted has limits. Those limits can be described with considerable accuracy. They apparently apply to groups of speakers, not just to individuals. That is, there are groups, norms, so far as variation is concerned. Students, group-specific language varieties are the focus of interest of various investigations concerned with the social symbolic function of language. Its group-specific characteristics or insignia. Methodology of empiric sociolect research. In Germany, for example, tests on language evaluation and speaker assessment conducted in empirical studies on dialectical and sociolectical significance of stigma, or on the use of dialectics in rural communities, were systematically integrated into methodical appliance. Students, such procedures enable access to the collective knowledge of the test candidates concerning speech variation and stereotype assessment on variations on a basis of only a small number of features. Students, these features can be symptomatic indications for stigma or prestige variations, or speech strata or local speech variations, and for the speaker's origin and educational grade, but they can also be part of the education of groups defining themselves by their use of language. For example, professional language, jargon, scientific language, inasmuch as one does not wish to classify them as functional variations. In a broader sense, sociolectical features can be observed wherever a group defined by social features is also marked by its symbolic use of a characteristic language variety, that is, specific lexical, grammatical, and intonational patterns. Students, in a more specific approach, Loeffler supports that the label primary sociolects only to those speech variations that do not include variations influenced by professional or special field, and which he classifies into temporal, and habitual social acts. Students, transitory social acts primarily involve the so-called age group languages, the special forms of language used by children and youth, or by pupils and students. Students, biological categories such as age and gender, language of women, for example, being objects of sociologic interpretation, are in a more narrow view only used for the definition of social acts because they induce cohesion of subcultural groups such as youth groups, adolescent gangs, feminist and homosexual groups. Students, the language of soldiers, similarly, inmates or foreigners can be included in the area of transitory social acts in as much as they cannot be counted as habitual social acts. Students, temporal social acts are special forms of language use in areas such as sports, hobbies, and leisure groups, which occasionally display very specific jargons. Examples for these are language in sport among footballers, golfers, and riders. Habitual social acts are gender-specific ways of speaking, or sexual acts, as well as the classic special variations, the so-called language of thieves, beggars, etc. Yiddish language of merchant Jews, and Hellenic language of the traveling people, the Gypsy language of the Sinti and Roma. These in turn influence the languages of the students' dwelling societies, the traveling tradesmen, and the urban peripheral groups. Some of their forms have since found entry into everyday and standard language. Students, the adoption of special language vocabulary into colloquial language simultaneously signals the constant change that subcultural jargon is subjected to if it means to retain its character as a group label. Students, the influence of language norms on group cohesion is exemplified in sects or politically extreme subcultures, even though their language has up to this point not yet been systematically analyzed.